Good late afternoon. I didn't know whether to say good evening or good afternoon, so I said both. Welcome. My name is Lynn Shaw, and I'm the director of the School of Occupational Therapy here in the Faculty of Health. And we're really, really pleased that all of you came out to hear our special guest speaker today. My job this afternoon, or late evening, is to be the MC for the festivities. So I would like to acknowledge students, faculty, community members, and some of our staff and some of our guests that have come. So welcome to everybody. At this point, I would like to introduce Fiona Black, who will be here on behalf of the university to participate and welcome to say a few words on behalf of Dalhousie. But I did want to introduce her to you. Some of you may or may not know Fiona Black. So Dr. Fiona Black became our Associate Vice President Academic in 2013 after a decade, that's funny to say that, after 10 years in Dalhousie's Faculty of Management, where she served as a professor and associate dean and director of the School of Information Management, having also been seconded to the role of Director of Academic Programs prior to taking on her current position. Dr. Black brings several years of academic and administrative experience to her role, and she's certainly been a very strong proponent of all the students in the university, and always as pleasant and welcoming, and I would like her to come and introduce on behalf of the university a words of welcome. Thank you, Fiona.
Not worthy, I don't think, of having applause, especially before you hear my 2 minutes. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to begin, this is all about community, returns to society, etc., through many, many different lenses. And on behalf of our Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia and beyond, I want to recognise in my comments that we are on traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq here at Dalhousie. And I want to recognise that this is Mi'kmaq History Week, if not month, and there are several things going on at Dal, and Mawiyomi is coming up in October. So I hope you're able to join us in celebrating Mawiyomi, which is the Mi'kmaq word for powwow. So that aside, this evening's event is very special and resonates in a number of different ways. I'd like to offer a special welcome to our distinguished guest, Dr. Thibeault, and to all of you. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to be here. I'm especially pleased that the organisers of this event, Dr. Heidi Leutner and Dr. Lynn Shaw, invited me. I realise that I am here instead of your very distinguished acting dean and former dean, both of whom are involved in other things just now. However, I'm pleased to be here because I'm a long-standing, huge admirer of the field of occupational therapy. For experiential reasons within my own family, I know what a difference you make in people's lives. Tonight's speaker works with, and in particular, with challenged communities, challenged in a number of different ways. And at Dalhousie, we have a suite of strategic directions. I'm not going to give you a lecture, 2 minutes or otherwise, about all 24 of our strategic directions, but several of them address the needs, first, to promote meaningful returns to society. That's one of what the President calls his 4 Rs, and the returns to society R is very important, through both our programs and our research. And second, to recognise that we have a moral and ethical obligation to support diversity and inclusion across our programs in our communities, to develop a more inclusive culture here at Dalhousie. And there is ever more work to be done for all organisations in that regard. At Dal, we refer to this second imperative simply as our respect priority, which we celebrated during the whole of last week. As many of you will know, you will have worn pink on Pink Day, you will have worn your respect badges and so on. And I know that particularly in fields such as occupational therapy, you live and breathe respect in all that you do, both before you joined this programme and thereafter. So providing returns to society is crucially important for us at DAL, and it relates to societal, health-related, and ecological, as well as economic sustainability and growth for all of our communities. And I note that, and these communities are both local and global, and I note with interest and pleasure that our Global Health Office here at DAL is a co-sponsor for this event along with the Faculty of Health. Our School of Occupational Therapy, its faculty members and students are particularly important members of the Dalhousie community. And you're all to be admired for your long-standing and effective commitment to our returns to society. And these goals around returns to society include many interconnections between student learning and communities of all kinds. You actually provide a model for us all. I speak about you sometimes to science and FAST students, some of whom I know have gone on from their FAST or science degree to apply to become one of you. So I'm looking forward to learning more from Dr. Thibeault. I know she's about to be introduced by our colleague. And again, welcome to you all, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Before we move into introducing our guest speaker, I have the privilege of actually introducing Dr. Elizabeth Townsend to you. The reason being is that Dr. Elizabeth Townsend provided our school with the fellowship in occupation and society that actually was part and parcel of us bringing Dr. Thibeault here and bringing her here so students, faculty, community members, guests could partake in all of the things that she is doing to help us grow and understand in the area of occupation and society through the communities. So, you know, a lot of us here do know Elizabeth Townsend, but some of us don't. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Townsend. She is a professor emerita within our School of Occupational Therapy at Dalhousie. She's also a fellow of the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists. And Dr. Townsend was one of the 4 founding faculty who actually started the School of Occupational Therapy in Atlantic Canada at Dalhousie in 1982. And such, if you do the math, you will know that we're celebrating our 35th anniversary of the school this year in occupational therapy. In 1997, she became a full professor, and she was the 2nd director of the school until 2010. And she was designated at that time to be Professor Emerita. I invite her kindly to come forward to tell us about her reasons for establishing the scholarship and what her intentions were, and to say a few words about Rochelle. Dr. Townsend.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to see many familiar faces and some I don't know of, so I hope to get to know you. It's a tremendous honor to be here for the lecture and also to listen to Rochelle Thibeault. First of all, though, I would echo Fiona Black's recognition that we are on Mi'kmaq territory and are grateful for that. Second, I thought I would give you the outline of the purpose of the lectureship. It supports a scholar in residence who can galvanize, stimulate, spark, whatever word you like. Lynn, you're coming down.
Because you're advancing her slides. So
I don't mean to do that, do I?
just go back.
I'll move over here.
Yeah.
And move this way. Good. Saved.
Yeah, it's good.
There we go, Rochelle. It's all new. They won't have seen a thing.
Okay, so I'll just leave it there for now.
Okay. I only have 2 minutes for this, so I will try to be brief, but I thought you might like to know that the purpose of the fellowship was to support, as I started with some adjectives, galvanize, spark, stimulate, the development of more research in the School of Occupational Therapy amongst faculty and students, and particularly with questions related to everyday life to the occupations broadly defined that constitute what we do every day, but recognizing that those are shaped by society, and what we do every day determines the kinds of societies and worlds that we can live in. So it's a very broad topic, and the lecturer can interpret that in some ways, but it's really to try and help us delve into this notion of occupation that I think Rochelle and I sort of came to recognize, and many others, probably about the early 80s. There was some deeper exploration about why we were called occupational therapists. Where does this occupation come from? And it's a field of research now called occupational science that certainly feeds occupational therapy, but it's broader than occupational therapy and is to investigate daily life, a kind of unrecognized maybe field of study. So the lectureship is open to many topics, but also to a focus on occupation and society. So I think we'll find it interesting to hear what Rochelle has to say. So first of all, though, I want to thank the School of Occupational Therapy for organizing the lecture. There's a whole series of visits and talks and so forth that Rochelle is involved in this week, and so she touches time with students as well as faculty, in addition to this fellowship. And then finally, just a thanks to Rochelle for coming. I've known Rochelle since the school opened, and this brave woman who was working in the Annapolis Valley contacted the school and said, I'm working on mental health services in Annapolis Valley, and I'm looking for guidelines for occupational therapy. I'm organizing a whole number of things to try and get people engaged in doing something meaningful. Does this make sense? And of course it makes perfect sense. And from then we've been very good friends as well as colleagues. And I want to just finally tell you of one of the things that she has done, whether she'll tell you about it or not, that to me captured the potential to understand occupation deeply and apply it to world events. She has spent time in Sierra Leone. And as you know, Sierra Leone has had many challenges, and she ended up working with a group that was trying to help child soldiers reintegrate. And, you know, what do you do? And some of you may have read the articles that she has written about this, but she began to see that the way to heal a community was through what people do every day, occupations, and she began to think about how they can live together, gardening together, creating homes together. And it seemed to me to show the power and the necessity of understanding how daily life is so fundamental to our human existence. And with that, I'll stop my theorizing about occupation, and thank you very much for coming.
And finally, I'd like to call on Dr. Heidi Lochner, who's an associate professor in the School of Occupational Therapy, to introduce our guest. Thank you, Heidi.
Thanks. It's a great honor to have Rochelle here with us today. So you know that she studies as an occupational therapist. She then came to Nova Scotia to do her master's degree in psychology, went on to complete her Ph.D. in community psychology, and then did a couple of postdocs in the US and Denmark. She's now a full professor at the University of Ottawa, where she focuses on community-based rehabilitation, which we'll be hearing about today, psychosocial care, and issues of meaning and resilience. She's worked around the world, and Liz, thank you for sharing some of those examples of the different communities that she's worked with. And these contributions have been marked in a number of different ways. So she's received an honorary degree. She has a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Society of International Health, and she's just received the title of Order of Canada, like you do. But in addition to these very notable achievements, I'm particularly struck by the compassion and kindness with which she engages in the world. So she's someone who definitely makes a difference in what she does, not only by what she does, but also how she does it, with kindness, compassion, integrity, and passion. So it's in these ways and many more that she embodies the qualities that Liz was talking about as far as the Townsend Fellowship. And so I'd just like to welcome you and have us all welcome you, and we look forward to your talk.
Well, thank you everyone for such a warm welcome. And I want to add that it's a real honor to be here for the Elizabeth Townsend Scholarship lecture. As Liz mentioned, we've known each other for a long time, and I have to say that Dalhousie was really instrumental in a lot of my choices. In the early days, I was asked to do some lecturing here, and I realized that I really enjoyed teaching. I got acquainted with research also through Dalhousie channels at the OT school. And so in many ways, you made me who I am, so thank you. And today we are going to speak more specifically about community-based rehabilitation. And it was really interesting when Heidi talked about the title, the connection between university students and communities. I realized that it's something that happens, but that I had never formalized. So in fact, the request to do this lecture made me go back and look at all the CBR projects I had been involved in that also involved students to make actually those processes of connectedness more explicit. And I chose one example, and it's not the most recent, but it's the one I would say that's the most complete, that really allows me to illustrate how students and communities got to connect through a CBR project. So just in a nutshell, if some people are not familiar with community-based rehabilitation, it's actually a strategy that was designed by WHO in the late 70s. Around 78, there were some discussions about creating a strategy that would really take into account community needs, and also within that CBR concept to do a lot of knowledge transfer to make sure that communities would also become as autonomous as possible in terms of their own needs, and defined very broadly, from healthcare to sustainable livelihoods, the whole continuum. And so CBR is really about starting from the difficult situation, be it trauma, illness, and bring people all the way to full social participation. It's always done with the lens of sustainability. So when you look at the old model of community developments, and I think of the olden days of the CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, where people would kind of just rush in very punctually, do their little bit and pull out, not taking into account the whole setting, the history, and how things would unfold after their departure. So CBR, in fact, was created to try to answer some of those problems. And again, to always keep in mind the key factor of social inclusion. And in 2004, again, WHO wanted to review the definition, and they realized that, in fact, community-based rehabilitation is the tool for all the rehabilitation personnel to bring about the equalization of opportunities, to reduce poverty, and to promote social inclusion for people with disabilities. And given the state of the planet, where resources are quite unequally distributed, WHO really wanted to keep the whole format fairly simple. So first of all, for social inclusion, they made sure that in all CBR programs, initiatives, it would be the fruit of combined efforts from people with disabilities, professionals, and communities. that in CBR, it's out of the question that there would be what of kind of discourses or conversations just among professionals, just among communities, or just among people with disabilities. You need the three pillars. And it's interesting, I was speaking with a colleague at WHO who actually spoke of it as a three-legged stool. He said, you cut one leg, things do not go too well. So you need those three groups always interacting within a CBR format. Also in CBR, you shoot for simple technology because you know that for sustainability, if you have something too sophisticated, it won't be usable in the long term. So we really try to use local competencies, local resources, simple technology so that people can carry on once you've helped launch the program. And again, in WHO's lens, CBR is way more than just a service delivery strategy. It's about changing mentalities. CBR is about changing the attitudes towards disability and really empowering vulnerable communities. So in fact, at the WHO, it's interesting to hear the conversations. Some people say, well, it's a strategy for intervention. Some people say, no, it's a philosophy. And I lean towards the philosophy that then gets implemented in strategies. That's how I resolve the dilemma. The core values for CBR, as I mentioned, are inclusion, empowerment, social justice, and enablement. And just to make the distinction between empowerment and enablement, empowerment has to do with the capacity to make decisions about one's life. For example, I may have disability, I may be using a wheelchair, and I decide that I don't want to live in an institution, I want to live outside in the community. Enablement is having the means to implement my decision. So I need to have all the means to have an accessible apartment, transportation, and that's why the two concepts always work together. The people have to have, I would say, the psychological stamina to say, I make decisions for myself, and then society should give them the means to enable those decisions. In the format for a CBR program, the basic format is always the same. At the very core, it's the people with disabilities and their families. And it really means that it's really client-centered. They make the decisions about their own lives. Then you bring in, and it's always within what we call a local CBR committee, you bring in all the relevant community members, and it could be neighbors, friends, willing to give a hand. Then you bring in the community leaders, the relevant ones, again, if the project is about health or education. So you bring in the teachers, you bring in the mayors, and they also take part in the committee. Then you move, again, one step into the hierarchy, and you involve local governments, NGOs, disability groups. And finally, you make sure that you're aligned with all the policies of national governments, and that you constantly, it's not on the diagram, but there's a constant dialogue going from the very core all the way to national government. And again, because often people with disabilities don't have that access because of stigma, they don't have access to the outer layers. Often it's going to be the role of the professional to be that bridge. And again, not to speak for people with disabilities, but to open the door so they can come and speak for themselves. But because of our social structures and often the helplessness that's been learned in the context of disability, because again of the social pressures, they need that little help from professionals to open those contacts with decision makers. And I just give an anecdote briefly from Sierra Leone. After the war, I worked a lot with the female child soldiers. And at the end of the war, they managed to start up wonderful, wonderful income-generating activities. And they actually made a fair amount of money. So we got to the point where they needed access to credit. They needed to go with the regular lending institutions, not just some grant for people with disabilities, but really go mainstream for financial assistance. And it was interesting because in Sierra Leone, although the law allowed women to have access to credit, that law would never be used. And the tradition was that women wouldn't get credit and women with disabilities even less so. And again, in CBR, we do a very careful analysis of power, looking at power differentials. And I always say I work from the principle of my ignorance, so I didn't know how to fight that battle. And but the female child soldiers, I mean, had really understood the CBR principles and the empowerment. And they told me, they said, when I said, who could solve this issue? They said, you. I said, me? I could solve the issue. They said, sure. They said, you carry a power that we don't have. They said, because you come through USAID, which is the equivalent, the American equivalent of CEDA, they said, you're connected with the American ambassador. You can request a meeting with the president. I said, yeah. I couldn't quite myself go up to the Parliament in Ottawa and say, hi, Justin, I'd like to have a chat. But in Sierra Leone, they said, you have that power. And I said, okay, I will ask for a meeting with the president because he was the only one who could put pressure on the banks to apply the law. But the girls were really clear. They said, we want you to really understand that you get the meeting, we go with you, and I really quote them, and once we get there, you shut up. And to me, it was really a sense of victory because they had understood that CBR was about empowerment and that my role as a professional, again, I was a conduit, not the person who was to be the spokesperson. So it's just a small example of how we negotiate all those different levels and that the ultimate goal is really that empowerment of people with disabilities. And again, what I wanted to share with you is the example of one program where students were involved all along the process and how it unfolded and the lessons learned. And I want to say that initially, it's interesting, in my mind, all I was offering, and it was for about half a dozen students at different times in the process, I just wanted to offer a different placement. And I wasn't thinking in terms of teaching them skills to connect with communities, not only there, but also here, working also within the Western world. And so before taking them to that placement, and it's a process that I do every time I go overseas, and with the reflection, and thanks for the question, by the way, for the topic, because it made me reflect, I realized that even with work I've done in Ottawa with some of the Syrian refugees, with Aboriginal communities in Canada, I apply the same process. Before going anywhere with the students, we have an exercise where we acknowledge our ignorance. And it's really the starting point. And it's really interesting that sometimes I feel I have to hold them back because they're so keen where their new knowledge. Sometimes they have a sense of expertise that is there, but just in one area. But the enthusiasm makes it kind of spill over in other areas. So it's kind of, let's hold back and let's see exactly the boundaries of our expertise. Because in CBR, the way we do it, it's really everyone around the table bringing different types of expertise, but they all have the same value. And so before even we get into the setting, I really want the students to understand that before connecting, we have to develop a psychological posture of openness and a willingness to learn, acknowledge that we don't know. And I often tell them, I start with a question that I experienced too. I said, what do you know, for example, about the lived experience of women with leprosy in Ethiopia? And they said, nothing. I said, it's exactly the point. and we cannot imagine what their lived experience is. The only thing we can do is ask and be guided. So it's the very, very first step to acknowledge the boundaries of our knowledge and ignorance. Then we have to manage expectations, because often there is also that, again, the enthusiasm, but that sense that we're going to change the world. And to me, I mean, I realized over the years that if I want the students not only to fully appreciate the experience, but also maybe to continue in that same kind of work, they have to lose the savior complex, to know that that's not where we're going. And I really tell them, even when they go, even for placements, for example, of 8 weeks, I tell them that placement is actually going to be more beneficial to you than to the community. And you have to accept that. But that experience is going to give you knowledge, experiences, and tools that in the long term will allow you to really have an impact in communities. And I said, it doesn't mean that if you don't change the community, that you don't bring something really valuable, but I really try to bring them down to the scale of relationships. And I tell them, if you just touch in a positive manner the lives that will touch your life during that experience, it's already a lot. And these words are from the American physician, Rachel Naomi Remen, who always tries, she teaches medical students and telling them, you have to bring things down to scale and simply touching the lives that touch yours. And what I also want to make clear before we go, even here in Canada, we have to be aware that we are just a whole network of different communities, and each community's got its culture. And that when we enter a community, in many cases, we're like a foreign species. And we have to remember that as a foreign species, we could have also detrimental impacts. And think about that. An example that I give sometimes, and it's new actually, I was listening on the news about that last week. There were monks, I don't know if you heard about that, who bought a whole bunch of live lobsters and crabs, and their intent, which was very compassionate, was to release them in the ocean. The lobsters and crabs were not from the Canadian East or American East Coast, but that's where they were released. And it's created havoc within the ecosystem. So the intent was pure, compassionate, but they didn't take into account the surrounding ecology. And so for me, it's really key that the students understand that it is not a world we're familiar with. And again, we need constant guidance from the people I call our cultural brokers to make sure we don't do harm, that we don't make vulnerable people already more vulnerable. And I just want to give a simple example. Again, I should have thought about it, but I didn't. A few years ago, I was in Ethiopia. It was raining cats and dogs, and I was working again with some women with disabilities, and decided, well, you know, the weather's so bad, we will drive them home after the meeting. And the women agreed, but I could sense, and especially one, there was a bit of reticence, but I didn't pay attention to that. Still, so we dropped them off at home despite the rain and all that. And the following morning, she came to me, she said, your intention was really good. But when people saw that I was driven home by white folks, they assumed I had been given money, her house was ransacked. And these may appear like details, but again, it's that ecological perspective that the students must be aware of if they want to connect to communities in a positive manner. And I don't want to frighten them, and we do that still with a certain lightness, but they need to be exposed to these ideas. And what we do, and again, it's in any setting, We use Vivian Chavez's concept of cultural immunity in intercultural healthcare. It's a model that was designed in the United States. And the premise is really that acquired education and credentials alone are really insufficient to address social inequality. You need a whole set of values, and you need a spirit, again, of connectedness, openness, in order to address social inequality. Credentials won't do it alone. And the principles are quite simple: to recognize and change the power imbalances, but you have to be aware that you may contribute to those imbalances, to develop institutional accountability. And to me, and it's interesting when I think of my situation at the University of Ottawa, I really tell them it's hell on earth to try to get a research project through ethics. There are no guidelines for placements. The students could literally go to any place, and there's no ethical reflection that's really imposed by the institution. There's no accountability, or next to none. I don't know what's happening at Dal, but I can tell you that in Ottawa, there are next to no guidelines in terms of, again, try to prevent the negative impacts that students could have. And the third principle is really to approach this work as lifelong learning and an exercise in critical self-reflection. Being able to look at oneself and say, do I contribute to the power imbalances and the social inequalities? In which ways? To keep that voice constantly going in the back of our minds. And so the example I chose to talk about is from Nicaragua. And I worked there for about 10 years, pretty much from 1998 to about 2009. And we were working in Leon, near Leon, so on the western side. And the project was designed initially to, and again, it's something very specific to CBR. The money was given by USAID to provide services to the war survivors. I mean, Nicaragua was the site of a civil war in the 90s, and money was given for the war survivors. And it was actually given by the Leahy War Victims Fund. And the project was with an American NGO called the Polis Center for Social and Economic Development. And something you want to avoid in CBR is really exclusion and really targeting just a narrow part of society to the detriment of other groups. And not only because you exclude, but if you favor a group, you create the risk of backlash. And so we renegotiated the whole agreement, and it ended up being money to actually provide services for people with disabilities in the Leon area. And so my role and that of the students were involved in the whole process. We ran community consultations to really get to know the needs of the people. They contributed to the project design, how things would unfold. They were there for the implementation and the follow-up. So the key initial steps in all CBR programs include mapping the services. You want to make sure that you are not going to duplicate services that exist already. So you want to make sure that before entering the community, you know your community. You know what's offered there. You know the gaps. And so what we did at that stage, it was interesting, again, coming from our ignorance, we paired up the University of Ottawa students with students from the University of Lyon. They spoke the language, they knew the city, and together they went out and met with people. We identified key players, formal and informal leaders. They did interviews, they met with these people, and together they started mapping the services available. Together again, students and professionals and community alike, we started identifying gaps and redundancies seeing where there were some real gaps in the system. Through that system, that process, we had seen some of the local leaders, formal and informal, and then again, together, we decided whom we would try to associate with more closely. Who were the leaders who were not leaders for narcissistic reasons, but leaders who truly spoke for the community? And then those leaders really came on board for the project. And so the students really kind of witnessed the whole process, and we would have conversations. Why we would take, what would we favor this person rather than this one? And gradually we created the team. We used tools, and I don't have to get into details today. They are tools that you can download for free on the web. And they are tools that allow for participatory approaches and that really ensure that you have democratic process, that everybody's got a voice. And I can also leave the slides if some people want to go and take a look at the SAS tools, because it's really key. And I give an example. It's really key to know your community, and again, make sure that you create safe spaces for all the people involved. During the war in Nicaragua, like in most wars, a lot of women were raped, rape being a weapon of war. And so one of the subgroups was really the group of those women who had survived war and all its violence. But among the groups, among the war survivors, we had the ex-combatants who had been maimed by landmines or bullet wounds. So they were also part of the war survivor groups. So you can imagine you're not going to do a consultation with both groups in the same room. I mean, women wouldn't speak. And so clearly you have to do that analysis, that power differential analysis, and make sure that you protect each voice in the process. And the SAS tools are really useful in that whole intervention. So for the community consultation, we make sure that we respect local culture and languages and carry all activities in local languages. So, and it was really interesting. That's a place where the students had a bit of difficulty, because I really told them, I said, we're not doing the consultation. He said, how come? I said, we have the skills, you know, we've trained in this. I said, yes, but we're the wrong transmitters. And this is not our project. This is the community's project. I said, so our role will be to train local people on how to do consultations. And I said, we're going to be present, but we're not going to intervene. We will have interpreters who will explain to us what's going on, and then we will have debriefings with the team. But other people, local people, will do the consultation. And they really bristled at that, because again, that expert status is so new and fresh that they would have liked to do that. And so the community defined the project. That's what happens in CBR. So we did in-depth personal interviews. We did serial nominal groups with different stakeholders. And we always have what I call the cultural broker, always someone with us telling us that if we're going too far, the questions we ask, actually, again, it's the people we train to ask the questions, but making sure that, again, we don't make anyone more vulnerable. We use our power. So in that process, for example, we gained access to different ministries that the people with disabilities would have had no access to. But because we were foreigners under the USAID banner, we gained access, so we could go ask about resources that people might provide, but always with leaders from the community of people with disabilities. Again, we open doors, they speak. And with that information, we came back to the group and continued the conversation about what should be done and how. I don't have time to get in all the details. We use methodologies of fuzzy maps. I mean, trying to see who's got power, what kind of power, how they connect together. And we make sure that the projects are sustainable economically and environmentally, and that they are controlled by the community. In CBR, we have different tools. One that we use is really the CBR matrix. And basically, it's a checklist when you connect with a community, you want to make sure that you don't forget some of the needs. And it's just a tool that allows us to systematically look at all the different areas and formulate questions in a way that's accessible to all, but that will capture all those needs, because this matrix really embeds all the needs of human beings in society. And just to make sure we don't forget anything, systematically, the role of the CBR professional is to make sure that this is covered. But again, it's the answers from the community that will define what we are going to do next. And the students really enjoy doing that kind of surveying with the community. And what was interesting with CBR, they suddenly realized that rehab was way more than getting a wheelchair. When you do that exercise with students, I mean, they were looking at stuff like justice, I mean, marriage. They said, you know, I'm an OT, what's the point? What's marriage? What's got marriage to do with it? I said, it is part of human occupations. It's part of the network. I mean, we'll ask those questions and we go in that direction. And they were a bit cautious around the whole empowerment arena, and the political arena, but they realized that it's also part of the equation. And so with the matrix, we identified the need for rehabilitation services, for prosthetics and orthotics and mobility equipment, schooling, vocational training, microcredit for sustainable livelihoods, improving social status of the ex-combatants and the people with disabilities, and addressing children with disabilities needs. And so, again, it was always a conversation with community, and they learned to, even if they disagreed, because sometimes they said, well, I feel that this should come first, we don't decide. We have to listen to the community's voice, and we can express our opinion, but in the end, it's a democratic process. So that's what we came up with. We also use a scanning tool, which is the precede-proceed model from Green and Kreuter. And I don't have time to go into all the details, but it's just a tool that has 4 kinds of assessments. One that's called the social assessment, the epidemiological assessment, educational assessment, and administrative and policy assessment. And basically, it's a tool that allows us to better know the community, to know the traditions, the culture, the social the perceptions, to get the numbers, you know, how many people with disabilities, what kind of disabilities, to see what kind of educational opportunities there would be in that community, and to see what are the laws within the country that would support or hinder people with disabilities. So again, it's just a systematic tool that allows us to really analyze the community more in depth. We have an ethical process. Once with the community, as I told you, we define the goals, and then we get to see if those goals will really fit within the community. Then there's another step, making sure with each goal that we've selected, each intervention, we go through an ethical reflection. And again, I don't have time to get into all the details, but as you can see on the screen, you look at respecting people equally, serving priority needs, looking at what's most beneficial for society as a whole, more beneficial for just this group, looking if we are at odds with codes of practice. So we do, again, a very systematic reflection. And that was new to the students as well. And something I didn't realize, that in our training, at least in Ottawa, we hadn't given them tools to assess community collaborations from an ethical perspective. So that was one major tool, one of the major tools that students really retained and still use in their practice. So what were the outcomes? With the help of the students, we trained some local leaders. There's one on the screen. His name is Emmanuel. And again, we were in the background, but the students learned a really key lesson, which is to trust local competencies and skills. And it was really lovely when they realized that they didn't have to do it themselves, that they could do a knowledge transfer that would change a community, and that it was much more beneficial for the project to have a local face. And although initially they were reluctant to let go of, I would say, the glamour of being at the forefront, they realized it's not sustainable. You have to transfer knowledge and make sure that the people who carry the project are locals. When we, among the goals, there was again that clinic. They wanted a rehab clinic. And there too, it was interesting to see the students because they felt the people we trained were not professionals. We trained technicians and they really felt, well, you know, it's not fair, you know, professionals should do that. Again, being very proud of their knowledge, they were very reticent to say, well, we're not going to have technicians do what professionals should do. So they had to understand that context very greatly. What applies in Canada doesn't apply necessarily elsewhere. And sometimes, again, we have those ethical conflicts. Yes, we have norms, but what matters most is that people get serviced and that those services are done within local norms and that we have to agree with that. And it's just another example. The students were a bit upset. They said, well, you know, the piano technicians didn't have the same standard of those trained in Canada. But then they realized that they do an excellent job. So they had to be exposed to that diversity of practices that we need to maintain in order to be able to serve a broad range of communities with the resources available. Then in the process, also because people had identified livelihoods, when we did the consultation, they said, we want an internet cafe. And again, the students, there were OT and PT students, they said, well, we know nothing about this. It's not in our area, you know. Other people will do that. And I said, I know you're not computer specialists, but your role is to go towards full social participation. So you have to find the people who are computer specialists. You don't drop the ball. You find the people who can follow up, who can bridge that gap and make sure that we get to the end goal of full social participation. And I said, then your role is really to collaborate with the people who have locally, who have that competence. And again, but this was really nice, students became really keen and then to learn also from the local people around issues that don't belong necessarily to their training, but they started to see the interconnectedness of it all. Then we had, it was the same issue, we started up a local workshop to produce wheelchairs and walking aids and adaptations. And again, it was that small voice saying to the students saying, well, you know, it should be professionals. And they realized that with proper training, people actually produced excellent equipment. And there too, the students ended up in a strange position because we had to negotiate microcredit initially and then regular credit. And said, well, it's not in my training. You know, I'm not going to do that. And it was the same exercise feeling, you chose to do this kind of work. And so you are going to wade into waters that may not be familiar, but you need to bridge the gap, not necessarily to do it yourself, but to find the people who can make the whole picture come together. We worked a lot about inclusiveness. People with mental health issues have been excluded. And so there was a whole process of learning, again with the students, making it explicit. How do you try to bring into a community people that very same community has excluded? How do you change mentality? How do you try to slowly make some small steps so that people will develop in the field that openness, that spirit of inclusion? And it was the same thing for children in the school system. Another issue that students had to deal with that they found really difficult, the man that you see there was part of a microcredit project. And what the picture doesn't say, we had worked a lot with that man to get him fitted with a prosthetic leg. You can see that the leg is not on the picture. And the man actually wouldn't want to have anything to do with that leg. And the students were really upset, saying, well, we did all this work, we did the training, and now, the leg is on the shelf somewhere. And I said, yes, it hurts, but ultimately, it's the person's choice. And that man still manages full social participation with the choice he makes. Ultimately, it's his life. We gave the tools, but CBR is about respecting one's choice, even if they don't fit within our preferences. And so there were some other, again, it was other issues around doing carpentry, and we eventually got a whole flotilla of boats. And the students were not quite comfortable, said, we're not meant to build boats. No, but you will find people who can do that. And again, looking at the time, I will maybe skip a few slides. But there was another way that we connected that I thought was really important for the students to realize that when we speak about full social participation and creating the best possible conditions, it also means that we have to help rebuild civil society. And what you see on the picture, it's a picture that really moved me personally, because we used the CBR project to bring together ex-enemies. What you see at the far right, it's a man called Alejandro, and I don't have time to get into the details, but Alejandro was a Sandinista fighter. And the protocol during the war, when Sandinista was captured by a Contra, it was to tie the hands together, put a grenade, and detonate the grenade. A lot of the Sandinista fighters ended up being a double upper extremity amputees following grenade torture. And the guy at this end is Salvador, an ex-Contra, who lost his legs on a landmine. And it's really through the CBR, what we wanted the students to understand is that suffering is the great equalizer. And if you can have people recognize the same suffering into an enemy, suddenly the barriers will melt away. And it's really what happened at the clinic where people were coming for their treatments and all that. We put in presence the ex-enemies in the waiting room, and gradually they would hear conversations and realize they were all men who could no longer feed their families. And that recognition actually transcended the political affiliations. And it was through the whole rehab process that we created social examples of reconciliation through occupation. And for the students, it was quite an epiphany to see again that rehab could go well beyond what's traditionally encompassed in that term and include a role in the rebuilding of civil society. And I will skip that one for time's sake. And one tool that we used also to really make sure that learning would be really explicit and that the students would get the most out of the process, we use a monitoring evaluation learning grid that's based on Fetterman's empowerment evaluation principles. And it's a grid that I designed years ago with the help of the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and also that uses SAS tools. We don't have to go through all that, but I just wanted to give you an example. And the data actually in the matrix is from another project. I couldn't find the one from Nicaragua. It's been a while now. But what I want you to pay attention to is the third column, outcome indicators. The question we ask is, how do you define success? And how could you measure it? And you ask everyone in the CBR project, what does success mean to you? And from that question, we're going to derive indicators. And for example, with children coming to the clinic, I mean, what's success for a child? It's fun, having fun. And having fun, we translate it into attention span. If a child has fun, the child will pay attention longer. So anyway, I don't have time to go through it all, But as you can see, all the stakeholders will have a voice. And when we asked the students, how do you initially, they said, how do you define success? And for them, it was practical knowledge, something I want to apply, I can apply, and they got that. And again, I don't have to go through all the matrix, but we also have what's called the results indicators, or the unexpected outcomes. And what we found with the students, the unexpected outcomes was profound personal changes. They would all say, we got into that CBR, we got into connecting with communities, initially feeling we're going to change the world. In the end, we got changed a whole lot more. But for us, it was very important to make that whole transformational process explicit, for them to realize that they had been changed by the experience and that they understood the process, and that process was really anchored in some key principles. Again, the fact that they would recognize their ignorance, that they would be willing to be open and act in a very egalitarian fashion, act with humility, and that they would really listen to the community's needs. And so in a nutshell, that was the process to make that whole engagement of students in the CBR project much more tangible and more explicit. Thank you.
I'm sure we have time for questions.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with your point about respecting people's choices and autonomy and accepting if they reject what you offer them. But I struggle with that too, especially in international contexts where I feel like maybe they don't necessarily know what I have to offer or what I'm suggesting, how it could change their lives and their participation. So I was just wondering if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, because I fully agree with you. And the way we tend to do things, I really speak of a menu. In fact, that we explain clearly to the community what we can offer and how taking each offer could eventually unfold. So we have that process with the community, and again, we use social analysis systems tools to do that, so that they have the full picture. They understand if they make that choice, that will lead to that. And the way we present it, because initially people are a bit reluctant, well, we knew about these things, and we said, well, it's a little bit like we getting to see a new color. Unless we really explain it, show it to you, you won't know what it is. So from the menu, we really have to unpack what it would look like if we did that. And once that's been done, then they make a decision. And something else I didn't mention, in some circumstances, they may make choices that we would find morally reprehensible. And our stance is that we won't go there, because we know psychologically the worst possible scenario is to be at odds with one's core values. And so we will not jeopardize our own stability. I mean, obviously compromise is possible, but in some situations, I think in Sierra Leone, for example, I was asked to expand the female genital mutilation program in a safer way. No. We draw the line somewhere. It's clearly not something I was willing to do. So at that point, I mean, you choose to withdraw. Yes, we did. Up north, we actually did several programs mostly in Inuit communities. And it's interesting, it was way more difficult to do it in Canada than to do it overseas. Even in terms of involving students, it was interesting, those placements, I mean, it was years ago, those placements were not necessarily recognized by FCAOT, which was really strange in those days. They felt, it wasn't the usual box. Also, in Canada, clearly, again, I'm the wrong transmitter because I'm part of the colonizers. I have that barrier that I don't have elsewhere. So there's baggage in Canada that I don't have in other contexts. In Canada, too, we have so many rules and regulations that it's really hard to engage communities for insurance reasons, and also doing knowledge transfer. We had a lot of opposition from professionals in Canada. Well, you know, we're not going to have trained people, that kind of reaction, which we won't get in a context when all those rules and regulations are not in place.
Wow, lots of food for thought. So I think we can really take a lot from this, and we need to sort of reflect a little bit. But what I am struck by is the depth upon which the seriousness of engaging CBR was displayed for us. That this is a robust, detailed, thoughtful, difficult, challenging approach, but the results obviously are evident in terms of the work that you've done. And for us to be able to take from here and be able to do it in our own context is the challenge for us, and you've given us certainly a platform for that. So I just would really like to acknowledge what you've shared and to really thank you so much for bringing your work to light for all of us. I think it was just an enjoyable 60 minutes that we've had with you in terms of time. So thank you once again for that. So let's give her a round of applause. In closing also, we want to thoroughly acknowledge that we have a reception that we'd like to invite you to as you come down, if you'd like to speak with Rochelle and to engage in the reception. Today was possible not just because of the Townsend Fellowship, but because of the Global Health Office and Shauna O'Byrne's work in sort of also bringing this opportunity to light, and the fact